Standing in the conference room as VP Bradley Thompson slides the termination paperwork across the mahogany table. Your weekend charity work with veterans is affecting your focus on ITAR compliance, Valerie. We need someone fully dedicated. The irony burns. After 6 years of perfect export compliance audits, they're firing me for helping wounded soldiers. As I sign the papers, my replacement hasn't even been hired yet. 3 weeks later, the State Department audit notice arrives at our defense contracting firm. They want to review our $380 million export license renewal. My career at Morrison Defense Technologies began 6 years ago, fresh out of graduate school, with a master's degree in international relations and a specialized certification in international traffic in arms regulations. ITAR governs how American defense companies can export military technology, and it's incredibly complex. One wrong form, one missed deadline, one improper classification, and a company can face millions in fines or lose their export privileges entirely. Morrison Defense specialized in tactical communication systems for military and allied forces, radios, encrypted communication devices, satellite systems. Everything we built was considered dual-use technology, meaning it could serve both civilian and military purposes. That made our export compliance absolutely critical. Every shipment overseas required detailed documentation, State Department approval, and careful tracking. I loved the work. The regulations challenged me intellectually, and knowing our products helped protect American soldiers and our allies gave the job meaning. But what truly fulfilled me were my weekends at the Phoenix Veterans Rehabilitation Center. Every Saturday and Sunday, I volunteered helping disabled veterans navigate the maze of federal paperwork required for their benefits claims. Many had traumatic brain injuries that made processing complex forms difficult. Others had lost limbs and struggled with the physical act of writing. I'd sit with them for hours, translating bureaucratic language into plain English, helping them gather medical records, walking them through appeals processes when claims were denied. The work broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. These men and women had sacrificed everything for our country, and now they were drowning in red tape just to get the care they'd earned. My ITAR expertise made me uniquely qualified to understand federal regulations, and I could cut through confusion that left veterans frustrated and hopeless. Bradley Thompson joined Morrison as VP of Operations 2 years ago, brought in by CEO David Park to boost quarterly profits. Bradley was ambitious, sharp-suited, and obsessed with efficiency metrics. In his early 40s, with perfectly styled brown hair and a Harvard MBA on his wall, he saw every expense as a potential cut and every process as something to streamline. He'd questioned my veteran work before making comments about divided loyalties and time management priorities. I always reminded him that my compliance record was flawless. Morrison had passed every State Department audit, never missed a licensing deadline, and maintained an exemplary export compliance rating. My weekend volunteer hours had zero impact on my professional performance. Sarah Mitchell, our HR director, had been with Morrison for 15 years. In her late 50s, with graying auburn hair and wire-rimmed glasses, she understood the company culture before Bradley's arrival. She'd watched me build the compliance program from nothing and knew my value to the organization. But Bradley was her supervisor now, and she'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with the pressure he put on all employees to demonstrate company loyalty above all else. My assistant Janet Williams was 28 years old and had worked with me for 3 years. Bright, detail-oriented, and genuinely caring, she'd helped me train new compliance staff and manage our complex documentation systems. Janet knew every export regulation as well as I did and had become my trusted partner in maintaining Morrison's perfect record. The termination meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd arrived at work expecting a normal day when Sarah called and asked me to join her and Bradley in conference room C. The serious tone in her voice made my stomach clench, but I assumed they wanted to discuss the upcoming license renewal. Bradley didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a manila folder across the polished table and folded his hands. "Valerie, we've decided to restructure the compliance department. Your position is being eliminated." The words hit me like cold water. Eliminated? Our export license renewal is due in 6 months. The State Department specifically requires a designated compliance officer. "We'll be hiring someone new," Bradley said, his voice flat and professional. "Someone who can focus entirely on Morrison's needs without outside distractions." Outside distractions. The phrase confused me. My compliance record is perfect. We've never had a single violation or failed audit. Your weekend activities with veterans show divided loyalty, Bradley continued. We need someone whose complete attention is on Morrison's success. Your charity work interferes with the focus required for this position. I stared at him, genuinely stunned. You're firing me for volunteer work I do on my own time, work that doesn't interfere with my job performance in any way. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair but remained silent. I could see the conflict in her eyes, but she wouldn't challenge Bradley directly. It's about priorities, Bradley said. Morrison needs employees who put the company first. Your divided attention is a liability we can't afford. The irony was overwhelming. My work with veterans had made me more committed to my job, not less. Understanding how much our military relied on proper equipment export channels motivated me to ensure every regulation was followed perfectly. Seeing disabled veterans struggle with bureaucracy made me determined that Morrison would never add to their burdens through compliance failures. I signed the termination papers with shaking hands. Bradley offered me a 2-week transition period to document my procedures and train my replacement. When I asked who would be taking over, he admitted they hadn't hired anyone yet, but would find someone suitable quickly. As I walked back to my office, Janet's face went pale when I explained what had happened. She'd been helping veterans with paperwork herself, inspired by my volunteer work. Now she worried that her own job might be at risk if Bradley discovered her involvement. "This is insane," Janet whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "You're the only person here who truly understands ITAR regulations. How are they going to maintain compliance without you?" That question would haunt Morrison Defense Technology sooner than anyone imagined. During my final 2 weeks, I worked frantically to document everything I could. My procedures manual grew to over 200 pages, covering every aspect of export compliance, from initial licensing through post-shipment reporting. I created detailed checklists, contact lists for government agencies, and troubleshooting guides for common problems. But documentation couldn't replace experience. ITAR regulations weren't just rules to follow. They required judgment calls, relationship management with government officials, and deep understanding of how military technology classification worked. I'd spent 6 years building those skills and relationships. On my last day, Janet hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes. Sarah shook my hand and quietly said she was sorry things had worked out this way. Bradley was notably absent from my departure. As I cleaned out my desk, I discovered something troubling. In recent months, Bradley had been pressuring the export licensing team to expedite shipments without waiting for complete documentation reviews. He'd implemented new efficiency targets that required faster processing times, even when that meant cutting corners on verification procedures. I'd pushed back against these changes, insisting that compliance couldn't be rushed. Proper export licensing took time because the consequences of mistakes were severe. But Bradley saw my caution as resistance to his leadership. I documented these concerns in my personal files but didn't report them formally. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Bradley understood the risks better than I thought. Maybe the new compliance officer would have better solutions. 3 weeks later, I learned just how wrong those assumptions were. My new position with Veteran Business Solutions started the Monday after my departure from Morrison. It was a small consulting firm that helped veteran-owned companies navigate federal contracting requirements. The pay was 30% less than Morrison, but the work felt meaningful in ways my corporate job never had. Colonel Michael Roberts, a retired Army officer who ran the consulting firm, became my immediate supervisor and mentor. In his early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd commanded troops in combat, he understood both military culture and business realities. His own company specialized in helping small defense manufacturers compete for government contracts. "Valerie," he said during my first week, "Morrison Defense has quite a reputation in the veteran business community. They've been underbidding established companies by promising faster delivery times than anyone thought possible." This comment troubled me. Faster delivery in defense exports usually meant cutting corners somewhere, and ITAR regulations specifically required waiting periods for State Department reviews. There was no legal way to speed up the government approval process. Through my work with Colonel Roberts, I began meeting other veteran business owners who'd lost contracts to Morrison's aggressive pricing and delivery promises. They respected Morrison's technical capabilities, but questioned how the company could deliver so quickly while maintaining proper export compliance. Meanwhile, at Morrison Defense Technologies, my replacement was struggling with challenges I could have predicted. Amanda Foster was 26 years old, with a general business degree and an impressive resume from a large consulting firm. She was intelligent, articulate, and eager to prove herself. What she lacked was any background in international trade law defense regulations or ITAR compliance. Janet later told me about Amanda's first week. She'd been overwhelmed by the complexity of export documentation and confused by the multiple government agencies involved in defense trade regulation. The State Department, Commerce Department, Treasury Department, and Defense Department all had overlapping jurisdiction over different aspects of military exports. Amanda tried her best to learn from the documentation I'd left behind, but written procedures couldn't replace the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated. She didn't understand why certain forms were required, how to classify borderline technologies, or when exceptions might apply to standard procedures. Bradley grew impatient with Amanda's learning curve. He'd hired her expecting someone who could immediately take over my responsibilities, not realizing that ITAR compliance required specialized expertise that took months or years to develop. "Figure it out," he told Amanda when she asked for additional training. "The procedures are all documented. Just follow the checklist." But export compliance wasn't a simple checklist. Every shipment was unique. Every destination country had different requirements, and every product classification involved judgment calls that required deep regulatory knowledge. Janet tried to help Amanda as much as possible, but she was overwhelmed with her own responsibilities and worried about job security. The pressure to process exports quickly was increasing, and Bradley made it clear that delays would not be tolerated. Within her first month, Amanda made several critical errors. She processed shipments to NATO allies without proper State Department notifications, approved technology transfers that required additional licensing, and classified products incorrectly on export declarations. Janet caught some of these mistakes before they became serious problems, but she couldn't review everything while managing her other duties. Some errors slipped through and made it into the official export record. When a shipment to a British defense contractor got delayed at customs due to improper paperwork, Bradley blamed transition inefficiencies and demanded that Amanda get up to speed immediately. He refused to consider hiring additional compliance expertise or providing formal ITAR training. Amanda began copying documentation from previous shipments without understanding the legal requirements behind each form. If a similar product had been exported before, she assumed the same paperwork would work again. This approach created dangerous precedents and inconsistent classifications that would later attract government attention. The breaking point came in November, when Amanda processed several exports without realizing that the technology involved required special State Department approval under a different ITAR category. The shipments left the country before the error was discovered, creating potential violations that could result in significant penalties. Janet found the mistakes during a routine quarterly review and immediately brought them to Amanda's attention. Amanda panicked, realizing she might have violated federal law without knowing it. She begged Janet not to report the errors to management, hoping they could find a way to correct the documentation retroactively. This put Janet in an impossible position. She knew the errors needed to be reported and corrected through proper channels, but she also sympathized with Amanda's situation. Bradley had set Amanda up for failure by eliminating the only person with proper expertise and then demanding immediate results. During this same period, my work with veteran businesses was flourishing. Colonel Roberts' company won a major contract to supply communication equipment to the Army National Guard, partly because their compliance documentation was flawless. I'd helped them navigate the complex bidding process and ensure their export capabilities met all federal requirements. Other veteran-owned companies began seeking my consulting services. Word spread that I had the expertise to help small businesses compete with larger contractors while maintaining perfect regulatory compliance. My reputation in the veteran community grew as someone who understood both military needs and bureaucratic requirements. One evening in late November, I received an unexpected phone call from a contact at the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Lisa Chen was a licensing officer I'd worked with for years during my time at Morrison. "Valerie," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've received some concerning reports about Morrison Defense's recent export documentation. There seem to be inconsistencies in their submissions. My heart sank. What kind of inconsistencies? Nothing I can discuss in detail, but let's just say someone has been asking questions about their compliance procedures. You might want to know that your name came up as someone who used to handle their ITAR program very effectively. The implication was clear. Morrison's export compliance was deteriorating, and government officials had noticed. The perfect record I'd built over 6 years was being destroyed by corner-cutting and inexperience. Is there going to be an audit? I asked. I can't comment on ongoing investigations, Lisa said, but companies with compliance concerns typically receive additional scrutiny during license renewal processes. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment trying to process what I'd learned. Morrison's $380 million export license was due for renewal in a few months. If the State Department had concerns about their compliance, that renewal could be in jeopardy. Part of me felt vindicated. Bradley had fired me for allegedly not focusing enough on compliance, and now their compliance was falling apart without me. But I also felt sad for Janet, Amanda, and the other employees who would suffer if Morrison lost their export privileges. The next few weeks would prove that my concerns were entirely justified. The call came on a Tuesday morning in December. Sarah Mitchell's voice was tight with stress when she reached me at my consulting office. Valerie, I hope you're doing well. I'm calling because Morrison has received some concerning news from the State Department. I set down my coffee and gave her my full attention. What kind of news? We're being audited. The Directorate of Defense Trade Controls is sending a team to review our entire export compliance program as part of our license renewal process. They'll be here for a week starting in January. The severity of the situation hit me immediately. Routine license renewals typically involved paperwork reviews and conference calls, not on-site audits. When the State Department sent investigators to a company's facility, it meant they had serious concerns about compliance failures. Who's leading the audit? I asked. James Crawford. Do you know him? I knew the name and reputation. Crawford was a former Air Force colonel with 30 years of experience in defense trade controls. He'd led some of the most significant ITAR enforcement actions in recent years and had zero tolerance for compliance failures. Companies that failed his audits often lost their export privileges permanently. Sarah, that's very serious. Crawford only handles cases where they suspect major violations. How prepared is Morrison for this level of scrutiny? There was a long pause before she answered. That's why I'm calling you. Amanda is completely overwhelmed and Bradley is starting to panic. The audit notice specifically requests documentation going back 2 years, which includes most of your tenure as compliance officer. And the recent exports under Amanda's management, that's the problem. There have been some irregularities in the documentation. Janet has been trying to maintain quality control, but she's not trained to catch everything. We're discovering errors that should never have happened. I felt a mixture of frustration and sympathy. Morrison was facing exactly the crisis I'd tried to prevent through careful, methodical compliance work. But Bradley had eliminated that expertise to save money and demonstrate his authority. What does Bradley want me to do about it now? I asked. He wants to meet with you, unofficially, to discuss the situation and see if you might be willing to help us prepare for the audit. The irony was stunning. 3 months ago, Bradley had fired me for lack of focus on compliance. Now he wanted my help because Morrison's compliance was collapsing without me. I'll consider meeting with him, I said, but only if he acknowledges that the problems Morrison is facing directly result from his decision to eliminate experienced compliance oversight. I think he's starting to understand that, Sarah said quietly. That afternoon, Bradley called me personally. His confident, authoritative tone had been replaced by something much more uncertain. Valerie, I hope there are no hard feelings about your departure from Morrison. We've encountered some challenges with our compliance program that might benefit from your expertise. What kind of challenges? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Documentation irregularities, process gaps, the kind of issues that an experienced compliance officer would have prevented. We're facing a State Department audit that could affect our export license renewal. The $380 million renewal, yes. If we lose that license, Morrison loses 60% of our business. We'd have to lay off most of our workforce and might not survive as a company. The stakes were becoming clear. Morrison's aggressive cost-cutting had put the entire organization at risk. Hundreds of jobs depended on maintaining export privileges that were now in jeopardy. What exactly are you asking me to do? I said. Come back. We'll pay you double your previous salary and give you complete authority over compliance. No interference, no questions about your methods or your volunteer work. You fired me for divided loyalty 3 months ago. Now you want me back. I made a mistake, Bradley admitted. The compliance program has deteriorated since your departure, and we need your expertise to survive this audit. I told him I'd consider his offer and get back to him within a few days. But first, I wanted to understand the full scope of what Morrison was facing. Through Colonel Roberts and other contacts in the defense industry, I began learning more about Morrison's situation. Their reputation for fast delivery had attracted attention from competitors who wondered how they managed to expedite exports so quickly. Several veteran-owned companies had filed complaints with the Small Business Administration, claiming that Morrison was winning contracts through promises that violated ITAR timing requirements. The SBA had forwarded these complaints to the State Department as potential compliance concerns. I also learned that Morrison's recent exports had included several shipments that probably should have been classified under more restrictive ITAR categories. Amanda's practice of copying previous documentation had created inconsistencies that made it appear the company was deliberately miscategorizing products to avoid stricter licensing requirements. When I called Janet to check on her situation, she painted a disturbing picture of Morrison's internal operations. "It's chaos, Valerie," she said. "Amanda is working 16-hour days trying to catch up on documentation, but she doesn't understand the regulations well enough to fix the problems. Bradley keeps demanding faster processing times, and she's making more mistakes under pressure." "How bad are the documentation errors?" "Bad. We have shipments that left the country without proper State Department notifications, technology transfers that probably needed additional licensing, classification errors that could be interpreted as deliberate attempts to circumvent regulations." "What about David Park? Does the CEO understand what's happening? He's been traveling constantly and trusts Bradley to handle operations. I don't think he realizes how serious this audit could be." The more I learned, the more I understood that Morrison wasn't just facing a routine compliance review. They were under investigation for potential willful violations of federal law. If Crawford's audit uncovered evidence of deliberate regulatory circumvention, company executives could face criminal charges. That evening, I received another call from my State Department contact, Lisa Chen. "Valerie, I can't discuss specifics about ongoing investigations, but I wanted you to know that Morrison's audit will be comprehensive. Crawford's team will be examining every export from the past 2 years and reviewing all internal compliance procedures." "What are they looking for specifically?" "Evidence of systematic compliance failures, patterns that suggest deliberate corner-cutting rather than isolated mistakes, the kind of problems that indicate a company has prioritized profits over regulatory compliance. And if they find that kind of evidence, Morrison could lose their export license permanently. Executives could face criminal prosecution for willful ITAR violations. The company would be barred from any future defense contracting work." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment thinking about the choice I faced. Bradley was offering me a chance to return to Morrison with unprecedented authority and compensation. But I'd be walking into a crisis that might be impossible to resolve. On the other hand, Morrison employed 200 people whose jobs depended on maintaining export privileges. Janet, Sarah, and dozens of other employees who had nothing to do with Bradley's poor decisions would suffer if the company failed. And there were the veterans I'd been working with through my consulting practice. Many of them had small businesses that depended on Morrison as a customer or partner. If Morrison lost their export license, it would create ripple effects throughout the defense industry. The decision I made would affect hundreds of people's livelihoods and potentially determine whether justice was served for the poor choices that had created this crisis. 3 weeks later, James Crawford and his audit team would arrive at Morrison Defense Technologies with the authority to destroy the company entirely. The first Monday of January brought James Crawford and his 3-person audit team to Morrison Defense Technologies. I watched from across the street as they entered the building, carrying briefcases and laptops that would contain the tools to dissect every aspect of Morrison's export compliance program. Crawford himself was exactly what I'd expected from his reputation. In his early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, he moved with purposeful efficiency. His team included 2 compliance specialists and a technology classification expert, all with decades of experience in defense trade controls. I decided not to return to Morrison as an employee, but I was consulting with them on audit preparation. This arrangement gave me some protection from the investigation, while allowing me to help minimize the damage that Bradley's decisions had caused. Janet called me that afternoon with an update on the first day's proceedings. "It's terrifying, Valerie," she said, her voice shaky with stress. Crawford's team set up in the main conference room and started requesting documentation immediately. They want to see every export file from the past 2 years, all training records, compliance procedures, everything. How did Amanda handle their questions? She didn't. She broke down crying when Crawford asked her to explain our ITAR classification process. She admitted she doesn't understand half the regulations and has been copying documentation from previous shipments without knowing what it means. This was exactly what I'd feared. Amanda was a capable professional who'd been set up for failure by management that didn't understand the complexity of export compliance. Now she was facing federal investigators without the knowledge or support needed to represent Morrison effectively. What about Bradley? He's trying to take control of the situation, but Crawford isn't impressed by his MBA or business jargon. When Bradley started explaining his efficiency initiatives, Crawford cut him off and said they were only interested in regulatory compliance, not business optimization. The second day brought worse news. Crawford's team had discovered the shipments that left the country without proper State Department notifications. They'd found classification errors that appeared to show Morrison deliberately miscategorizing products to avoid stricter licensing requirements. Most damaging was their review of internal emails and memos. Bradley's pressure for faster processing times was documented in writing along with his dismissive comments about regulatory obstacles and bureaucratic delays. The audit team was building a case that Morrison had systematically prioritized speed over compliance. By Wednesday, Crawford had requested a meeting with Morrison's current ITAR compliance officer to discuss the violations they'd uncovered. Bradley was forced to admit that Amanda wasn't certified for ITAR compliance and that the company's only qualified officer had been terminated 3 months earlier. For what reason was the compliance officer terminated? Crawford asked during the meeting, according to Janet's account. Bradley tried to explain that my departure was due to performance issues related to divided attention, but Sarah interrupted him. Under direct questioning from a federal investigator, she felt obligated to tell the truth. Valerie Richardson was terminated because her volunteer work with veterans was considered a distraction, Sarah said. Her compliance performance was exemplary. We never had a single violation during her tenure. Crawford made notes without expression, but the implication was clear. Morrison had fired their only qualified compliance expert for reasons completely unrelated to job performance, then allowed their export program to deteriorate under inexperienced management. Thursday brought the most serious developments. Crawford's team discovered technology transfers that should have required additional State Department approval under stricter ITAR categories. These weren't simple documentation errors, but potential criminal violations that could result in prosecution of company executives. When Crawford asked Amanda to explain the classification decisions, she broke down completely. Through tears, she admitted that she'd been overwhelmed by the complexity of regulations and had made decisions without proper understanding of their legal implications. I tried my best, she sobbed, but nobody trained me properly and there was constant pressure to process exports quickly. I knew I was making mistakes, but I didn't know how to fix them. Crawford's expression remained neutral, but he was clearly documenting evidence of systematic management failures that had led to regulatory violations. Morrison wasn't just facing compliance problems. They were under investigation for potential criminal conduct. That evening, David Park finally returned from his overseas business trip to find his company under federal investigation. When he learned the scope of Crawford's findings, he immediately called an emergency board meeting. The board session lasted until midnight, as directors learned about the violations, the potential penalties, and the risk to Morrison's export license. Several board members demanded Bradley's immediate termination, while others focused on damage control strategies. By Friday morning, Morrison's situation had become desperate. Crawford's team had completed their document review and was preparing their preliminary report. The violations they'd discovered were extensive enough to justify immediate suspension of Morrison's export privileges. During the final interview session, Crawford asked the question that Bradley had been dreading all week. Who is your current registered ITAR compliance officer? Bradley's face went pale as he realized the full implications of the question. Morrison had no qualified compliance officer. Amanda had never been properly certified, and the company's only expert had been fired for reasons unrelated to compliance performance. We're in the process of hiring someone, Bradley stammered. Crawford closed his binder with deliberate finality. Then, Morrison Defense Technologies has been operating without proper compliance oversight for 3 months, during which time multiple violations occurred. This represents a fundamental failure of corporate responsibility. He stood up and gathered his materials. The State Department will be suspending Morrison's export privileges immediately pending completion of our investigation. Your pending license renewal is denied until these compliance failures are remediated. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Without their export license, Morrison couldn't fulfill international contracts worth over $100 million. The company would have to default on agreements with allies and partners around the world. Within hours of Crawford's announcement, Morrison's stock price began falling as news of the investigation leaked to defense industry publications. Major customers started calling to ask about order fulfillment, and several contracts were immediately canceled by nervous procurement officers. That evening, Bradley called me from his office. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something approaching panic. "Valerie, we need you back immediately. Whatever salary you want, whatever terms you require, we'll agree to them. Morrison is facing bankruptcy if we can't restore our export license." "What exactly is Crawford requiring for license restoration?" I asked. "Complete overhaul of our compliance program, new procedures, retraining for all staff, and demonstration that we have qualified expertise managing export controls." "And you think I can fix 3 months of systematic violations?" "You're our only hope," Bradley said. "You know Crawford's standards. You understand what the State Department requires, and you have the expertise to design a compliance program that will satisfy their concerns." I told him I'd consider his request and call him back within 24 hours. But first, I wanted to consult with people whose judgment I trusted about the ethical implications of helping Morrison recover from their self-inflicted crisis. Colonel Roberts was direct when I explained this situation to him. "Valerie Morrison created these problems through poor management decisions that prioritized profits over regulatory compliance. They fired you for doing your job too well, then destroyed everything you'd built through inexperience and corner-cutting." "But 200 people could lose their jobs if Morrison fails," I pointed out. "And how many veteran-owned businesses lost contracts because Morrison was making promises they couldn't legally keep? How many competitors suffered because Morrison was cutting corners to underbid them?" His perspective forced me to think about the broader implications of Morrison's compliance failures. Their corner-cutting hadn't just violated federal law, it had created unfair competitive advantages that harmed other companies. That night, I made this decision that would determine not just my future, but the fate of Morrison Defense Technologies and everyone who depended on the company's success. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. David Park Morrison's CEO stood at my door looking like he hadn't slept in days. In his mid-50s with graying black hair and usually impeccable grooming, he now appeared haggard and desperate. "Valerie, may I come in? I need to talk with you about Morrison's situation." I invited him into my living room, curious to hear his perspective on the crisis that had engulfed his company. "I'll be direct," David said, settling into my couch. "I made a terrible mistake trusting Bradley's judgment about compliance management. I was traveling constantly focused on international business development, and I didn't realize he was dismantling the expertise you'd built." "What did you know about my termination?" I asked. "Bradley told me you were leaving for a better opportunity. I had no idea he'd fired you for volunteer work, and I certainly didn't know he was planning to operate without qualified compliance oversight." David's confession revealed the communication breakdown that had enabled Bradley's poor decisions. As CEO, David bore ultimate responsibility for Morrison's compliance program, but he'd delegated that authority without ensuring proper oversight. "The board met again last night," David continued. "Bradley has been terminated immediately. Sarah Mitchell is serving as interim operations director, and I'm personally overseeing all compliance activities." This news wasn't surprising, but it represented a significant shift in Morrison's leadership structure. Bradley's aggressive cost-cutting approach had been replaced by crisis management focused on regulatory compliance. "What are Crawford's specific requirements for license restoration?" I asked. "Complete documentation review for all exports in the past 2 years, new compliance procedures that meet current State Department standards, retraining for all employees involved in export activities, and demonstration that Morrison has qualified expertise managing the program." That's months of work, assuming the State Department accepts whatever remediation plan you propose, which is why I'm here personally asking for your help. Not as an employee, but as a consultant with complete authority over compliance decisions. You'd have carte blanche to implement whatever changes are necessary. David's offer was more generous than Bradley's desperate phone calls, but it also carried enormous risks. Taking responsibility for Morrison's compliance program meant accepting liability for fixing violations that I hadn't created. What about the employees who depend on Morrison for their livelihood? I asked. 200 jobs are at stake, David said. Janet, Sarah, Amanda, and dozens of others who had nothing to do with these compliance failures. If we can't restore our export license within 60 days, we'll have to begin layoffs. The human cost of Morrison's crisis was becoming clearer. Bradley's poor decisions would ultimately harm the people who'd had no voice in creating the problems. I need to think about this, I told David. Give me until Monday to make a decision. After he left, I spent the weekend consulting with Colonel Roberts' other veteran business owners and professionals in the defense industry. Their perspectives helped me understand the broader implications of Morrison's situation. Morrison's compliance failures had created competitive advantages that harmed legitimate businesses. Their promises of faster delivery had been based on corner cutting that violated federal regulations. Other companies had lost contracts because they couldn't match Morrison's unrealistic timelines. But Morrison also employed 200 people and supported dozens of smaller suppliers and contractors. The ripple effects of their collapse would harm innocent workers and businesses throughout the defense industry. Monday morning, I called David with my decision. I'll help Morrison restore compliance, but not as an employee and not on your timeline. I'll work as an independent consultant with complete authority over all export-related decisions. What are your terms? First, I want triple my previous salary paid as consulting fees with a 6-month guaranteed contract. Second, Morrison establishes a veteran business development fund with $5 million to help small companies compete for defense contracts. Third, written company policies protecting employee community involvement and volunteer work. Those terms are expensive but acceptable, David said. Fourth, I want complete transparency about Morrison's compliance history and full authority to report violations to appropriate government agencies if necessary. I won't help cover up past mistakes, only prevent future ones. Agreed. When can you start? Immediately. But first, I need to understand the full scope of what Crawford discovered during his audit. That afternoon, I met with Sarah Mitchell and Janet Williams to review Crawford's preliminary findings. The violations were more extensive than I'd realized from secondhand reports. Morrison had processed 47 exports without proper State Department notifications. They'd classified 32 products under incorrect ITAR categories, probably to avoid stricter licensing requirements. Most seriously, they'd transferred technical data to foreign partners without required approvals, creating potential criminal violations. How did Amanda miss so many basic requirements? I asked Janet. She was copying documentation from previous shipments without understanding what each form required, Janet explained. When products were similar but not identical, she assumed the same paperwork would work. And Bradley's pressure for faster processing, constant. He implemented efficiency targets that required completing export documentation in half the time you used to take. Amanda was sacrificing accuracy for speed because that's what management demanded. The pattern was clear. Morrison's violations weren't random mistakes, but systematic corner cutting, driven by management pressure to prioritize profits over compliance. I spent the next week developing a comprehensive remediation plan that addressed every violation Crawford had identified. The plan included new procedures, enhanced training programs, and quality control measures designed to prevent future problems. Most importantly, I insisted on hiring additional compliance staff with proper ITAR certification. Morrison couldn't depend on a single expert again. They needed redundant expertise to ensure continuity of operations. The following Monday, Crawford returned for a follow-up meeting to discuss Morrison's response to the audit findings. I accompanied David and Sarah to represent the company's new compliance approach. Crawford reviewed my remediation plan with careful attention to detail. His questions were technical and specific, designed to test whether Morrison truly understood the problems they'd created. Ms. Richardson, he said after reviewing the documentation, your plan addresses the technical compliance issues we identified. But how do we ensure Morrison's management won't repeat the cost-cutting decisions that created these violations? The board has implemented new governance policies requiring compliance review for all operational changes, I explained. Additionally, the compliance department now reports directly to the CEO with authority to halt any activity that could create regulatory violations. And what about the cultural issues that led to these problems? The pressure to prioritize efficiency over compliance. We're implementing company-wide training on the importance of regulatory compliance and the consequences of violations. Every employee will understand that Morrison's export license is essential to the company's survival. Crawford made notes without revealing his assessment of our plan. After 2 hours of detailed questions, he stood up to leave. The State Department will review Morrison's remediation proposal and determine whether it adequately addresses the violations we identified. You should receive our decision within 30 days. As Crawford left, I realized that Morrison's fate now depended on convincing federal regulators that the company had fundamentally changed its approach to compliance. The next month would determine whether 200 jobs could be saved and whether Morrison could rebuild the reputation they'd destroyed through poor leadership. The most challenging part of the remediation would be proving to skeptical government officials that Morrison's compliance failures were management mistakes rather than deliberate criminal conduct. That evening, I received a call from Lisa Chen at the State Department. Valerie, I can't comment on Morrison's specific case, but I wanted you to know that Crawford was impressed by the thoroughness of your remediation plan. He rarely sees companies take full responsibility for compliance failures and implement such comprehensive corrections. Does that mean Morrison has a chance of getting their license restored? It means they're doing everything right to demonstrate genuine commitment to regulatory compliance. The final decision will depend on whether the State Department believes the changes are sufficient to prevent future violations. As I hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Morrison's crisis began. The company had a chance to survive, but only if they could prove they'd learned from their mistakes and implemented lasting changes. The next few weeks would test whether Morrison's commitment to compliance was genuine or just another attempt to manipulate their way out of consequences for poor decisions. The State Department's response arrived on a Thursday afternoon in February, delivered by certified mail to David Park's office. Sarah Mitchell called me immediately after David finished reading the letter. "They're offering conditional license restoration," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Morrison can resume limited export operations under enhanced oversight while we complete the full remediation program." "What are the conditions?" I asked. "All exports must be pre-approved by the State Department for the next year. We have to submit quarterly compliance reports, and we need to demonstrate sustained improvement in our compliance program before full privileges are restored." The terms were strict but fair. Morrison would be operating under a microscope, with government officials scrutinizing every export decision. But they could resume international business operations and begin fulfilling their backlog of contracts. More importantly, the conditional restoration meant that Crawford's audit team had concluded Morrison's compliance failures were management mistakes rather than criminal violations. The company would face significant financial penalties, but wouldn't be permanently barred from defense trade. David called a company-wide meeting to announce the news and explain what conditional license restoration meant for Morrison's future. The relief in the room was palpable as employees learned their jobs were secure, at least temporarily. Amanda Foster approached me after the meeting with tears in her eyes. "Valerie, I want to apologize for the mess I created. I was completely out of my depth with ITAR compliance, but I was too proud to admit I needed help." "Amanda, you were set up for failure by management that didn't understand the complexity of export regulations. The mistakes weren't entirely your fault. I've decided to transfer to domestic sales," she said. "Export compliance requires expertise I don't have and can't develop quickly enough. I'm better suited for work that doesn't carry such serious legal consequences." Her decision was wise and mature. Amanda was a capable professional who'd learned important lessons about recognizing her limitations and asking for help when facing complex challenges. Janet Williams, meanwhile, was thriving in her expanded role as Senior Compliance Coordinator. She'd enrolled in advanced ITAR training and was developing the expertise needed to support Morrison's compliance program long-term. "Working with you has shown me how rewarding compliance work can be when it's done properly," Janet told me. "I want to build the skills needed to prevent future crises." The most significant change was in Morrison's corporate culture. David Park had implemented monthly compliance briefings for all employees, emphasizing that regulatory adherence was everyone's responsibility, not just the compliance department's concern. The board of directors established a compliance committee with authority to review all operational changes and ensure they didn't create regulatory risks. No future VP would have Bradley's autonomy to make decisions that could jeopardize Morrison's export license. My consulting contract with Morrison was extended for a full year, with responsibility for rebuilding the compliance program and training the next generation of export specialists. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, as I could see tangible improvements in Morrison's regulatory culture. The Veteran Business Development Fund I'd negotiated was becoming operational, providing grants and mentorship to small defense companies owned by former military personnel. Colonel Roberts' firm received the first grant, which helped them hire additional engineering staff and compete for larger contracts. Valerie and Colonel Roberts said during one of our monthly consulting meetings, Morrison's crisis turned into an opportunity for the entire veteran business community. The fund is creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. His observation highlighted an unexpected positive outcome from Morrison's troubles. The company's near collapse had forced recognition that veteran-owned businesses deserved better support and more equitable competition opportunities. My volunteer work at the Phoenix Veterans Rehabilitation Center continued and expanded. Morrison's corporate partnership provided funding for additional counselors and streamlined benefit processing systems. Veterans who previously waited months for disability determinations were now receiving decisions in weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me that the volunteer work Bradley had condemned as a distraction was now enhancing Morrison's reputation in the veteran community. The company was attracting talented former military personnel who appreciated Morrison's commitment to supporting their community. In March, I received an invitation to speak at the annual Defense Trade Controls Conference, a gathering of government officials and industry compliance professionals. My presentation on building sustainable compliance programs drew standing ovations from attendees who'd followed Morrison's crisis and recovery. Crawford himself approached me after the presentation. Ms. Richardson Morrison's remediation program has become a model for how companies should respond to compliance failures. Your approach balanced accountability with practical solutions. What made the difference? I asked. Complete transparency about past mistakes and genuine commitment to preventing future violations. Too many companies try to minimize their problems or blame external factors. Morrison acknowledged responsibility and implemented comprehensive changes. His assessment confirmed that Morrison had successfully rebuilt its reputation with government regulators. The company was no longer seen as a compliance risk, but as an example of how proper remediation should be conducted. By April, Morrison's export operations were running smoothly under State Department oversight. The pre-approval requirements added processing time, but ensured every export met the highest compliance standards. Customer confidence was returning as international partners saw evidence of improved regulatory management. David Park announced first-quarter financial results that exceeded expectations despite the operational constraints. Morrison's reputation for reliability and compliance was attracting new customers who valued regulatory certainty over the fastest possible delivery times. Valerie, David said during our monthly progress meeting, Morrison is a stronger company now than before the crisis. We've learned that sustainable business success requires balancing efficiency with compliance, not choosing one over the other. The most gratifying development was seeing Morrison's employees embrace the importance of regulatory compliance. Training sessions I conducted were well attended with employees asking thoughtful questions about how their work contributed to overall compliance objectives. Janet Williams was emerging as a compliance leader who could eventually replace me when my consulting contract ended. She'd completed advanced ITAR certification and was developing the institutional knowledge needed to maintain Morrison's program independently. I want to be the kind of compliance officer you were, Janet told me. Someone who prevents problems before they become crises and builds relationships with government officials based on trust and competence. As spring turned to summer, Morrison's transformation was nearly complete. The company had evolved from an organization that saw compliance as an obstacle to efficiency into one that viewed regulatory excellence as a competitive advantage. The State Department's quarterly review in June noted Morrison's exemplary progress in implementing compliance improvements and recommended full license restoration ahead of the original timeline. Crawford's team had found 0 violations in their follow-up audits. My year-long consulting contract was approaching its end, and Morrison was ready to manage their compliance program independently. The systems I'd implemented were functioning smoothly, and the staff had developed the expertise needed to maintain high standards without external oversight. But first, there would be one final test of Morrison's commitment to the principles we'd worked so hard to establish. September brought the news that would prove Morrison's transformation was genuine and lasting. The State Department announced full restoration of Morrison's export privileges effective immediately. Crawford's final audit report praised the company's comprehensive remediation efforts, and sustained commitment to regulatory excellence. David Park called another company-wide meeting to announce the restoration and thank everyone who'd contributed to Morrison's recovery. The applause when he mentioned my role in leading the remediation was overwhelming, but the real victory belonged to employees who'd embraced new standards of compliance and accountability. Valerie, David said after the meeting, the board has voted to establish the Richardson Center for Compliance Excellence as a permanent part of Morrison's operations. We want to ensure the lessons we've learned are never forgotten. The center would provide ongoing training for Morrison employees and serve as a resource for other defense companies seeking to improve their compliance programs. It represented institutional commitment to regulatory excellence that would outlast any individual executive's tenure. My consulting contract officially ended in October, but my relationship with Morrison continued through the Veteran Business Development Fund and occasional speaking engagements. The fund had disbursed over $2 million in its first year, helping 37 veteran-owned companies expand their operations and compete for larger contracts. Colonel Roberts' firm had grown from 12 employees to 45 winning contracts that previously went to larger competitors. His success story was being repeated across the veteran business community as the fund provided access to capital and expertise that had been unavailable before. Morrison's crisis created opportunities none of us anticipated, Colonel Roberts said during the fund's first annual meeting. Sometimes disasters become catalysts for positive change if people respond with integrity and vision. My own consulting practice had expanded beyond my expectations. Defense companies throughout the country were seeking my expertise in building compliance programs that balanced efficiency with regulatory requirements. The Morrison model was being replicated across the industry. Janet Williams had been promoted to Director of Export Compliance, with authority over a staff of 6 specialists. Under her leadership, Morrison's compliance program was setting new industry standards for thoroughness and effectiveness. I learned from you that compliance isn't about following checklists, Janet said during her promotion ceremony. It's about understanding the reasons behind regulations and building systems that protect both national security and business interests. Amanda Foster had found her calling in domestic sales where her business skills could flourish without the regulatory complexity that had overwhelmed her in export compliance. She'd become one of Morrison's top-performing sales representatives and was being considered for management responsibilities. I learned important lessons about recognizing my limitations and asking for help when facing unfamiliar challenges, Amanda told me. Those lessons apply to every aspect of my career now. Sarah Mitchell had been permanently appointed as Chief Operating Officer, bringing a focus on employee welfare and sustainable business practices that contrasted sharply with Bradley's aggressive cost-cutting approach. We learned that treating employees well and maintaining high standards creates better business outcomes than squeezing every penny from operations, Sarah said. Valerie's volunteer work made her a better compliance officer, not a distracted one. The Phoenix Veterans Rehabilitation Center had expanded its services using funding from Morrison's corporate partnership. Veterans who previously waited months for benefit processing were now receiving assistance within weeks, and success rates for disability claims had increased dramatically. My weekend volunteer work continued, but now I had support from Morrison employees who donated their time and expertise. Engineers helped veterans understand technical aspects of their disability claims, while HR professionals assisted with employment searches and career transitions. The integration of corporate resources with community service had created a model that other companies were beginning to adopt. Morrison's reputation in the veteran community was attracting talented former military personnel who appreciated the company's genuine commitment to supporting their community. In November, I received an unexpected honor. The International Association of Defense Trade Compliance Officers presented me with their annual award for excellence in regulatory stewardship. The ceremony was held in Washington, with attendees including Crawford and other government officials who'd witnessed Morrison's transformation. Valerie Richardson exemplifies the highest standards of compliance leadership, the association president said during the presentation. Her work with Morrison Defense Technologies demonstrates how companies can recover from serious violations through accountability, transparency, and genuine commitment to regulatory excellence. Crawford's presence at the ceremony was particularly meaningful. During his remarks, he noted that Morrison's remediation program had become a case study used in government training for auditors and enforcement personnel. The Richardson model shows that companies can learn from mistakes and emerge stronger, Crawford said. Morrison's transformation from a compliance failure to an industry leader proves that proper leadership and accountability can overcome even serious regulatory violations. The most gratifying recognition came from the veteran community itself. The Disabled American Veterans Organization presented me with their Distinguished Service Award for my work helping veterans navigate benefit processes and supporting veteran-owned businesses. Valerie's dedication to helping veterans has improved thousands of lives, the DAV commander said. Her work proves that individual commitment to service can create lasting positive change. As 2024 drew to a close, I reflected on the journey that had begun with my termination from Morrison for allegedly not focusing enough on compliance. The crisis that followed had ultimately strengthened every aspect of what I'd been trying to achieve. Morrison had evolved into a company that valued both regulatory excellence and community service. Their compliance program was setting industry standards, and their support for veteran businesses was creating opportunities throughout the defense sector. My consulting practice was thriving as other companies sought to implement the principles we'd developed during Morrison's remediation. The Richardson model was being taught in business schools and government training programs as an example of effective crisis response. Most importantly, my volunteer work with veterans had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined possible. The corporate partnerships and community relationships built during Morrison's crisis had created sustainable support systems for veterans facing bureaucratic challenges. The lesson was clear. Integrity and compassion aren't weaknesses to be eliminated in pursuit of efficiency. They're sources of strength that create sustainable competitive advantages and meaningful relationships. Companies that prioritize short-term profits over long-term values eventually face crises that test their fundamental character. Those that respond with accountability, transparency, and genuine commitment to improvement can emerge stronger than before. Morrison's story proved that people and organizations can learn from their mistakes and transform themselves through dedicated effort and principled leadership. The volunteer work that Bradley had condemned as a distraction had ultimately become the foundation for rebuilding Morrison's reputation and creating lasting positive change. Sometimes losing what you think you need leads to gaining what you actually deserve. When companies choose temporary efficiency over enduring integrity, they discover that cutting corners eventually undermines their entire foundation. My termination had seemed like a devastating setback, but it became the catalyst for achievements I never could have imagined while working within Morrison's previous culture. The crisis forced recognition of principles that had always been important, but hadn't been properly valued. The Veteran Business Development Fund had helped dozens of companies grow and compete more effectively. The compliance training programs had raised standards throughout the defense industry. The volunteer support systems had improved thousands of veterans' lives. Most significantly, Morrison had evolved into an organization that proved business success and social responsibility could reinforce each other rather than compete for resources and attention. The transformation was complete, but the impact would continue for years to come. Morrison's example was inspiring other companies to examine their own values and consider how they could better serve both business objectives and community needs. As I looked toward the future, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The termination that had seemed so unfair had ultimately created opportunities to make a more significant difference than I ever could have achieved through traditional career advancement. Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for your values seemed to cost you everything, only to discover later that your principles were actually your greatest asset? Morrison's story shows that companies and individuals who prioritize integrity over expedience often discover that doing the right thing creates unexpected opportunities and lasting success. I'd love to hear your thoughts about balancing professional obligations with community service and how companies can better support employees who contribute to their communities. Please share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if Morrison's transformation resonated with you. Thank you for joining me on this journey of accountability redemption and the power of staying true to your values even when others don't understand their importance. Subscribe for more stories about how integrity and perseverance can overcome even the most challenging obstacles, and share this video with anyone who might benefit from Morrison's lessons about the true sources of sustainable success. Remember, sometimes the work that matters most is the work others think matters least. When companies and individuals prioritize genuine value creation over short-term gains, they build foundations that can weather any crisis and emerge stronger than before.